Hello and welcome back to another episode of History Now. Back in the studio for this one, and today we're going to get to, indulge myself and talk about two of my favourite things. It's history and pro wrestling. And joining me today to talk about the history of professional wrestling in Northern Ireland is promoter Nick Campbell, whose new book, Falls, Brawls and Townhalls, is available at the minute. And also joining Nick is a legend in Northern Irish wrestling, and that is Finlay Sr. So you're both very welcome to the show. Thanks very much. Nick, if I can go to you first, this is your new book, Falls, Brawls and Townhalls, the history of wrestling in Northern Ireland. I know you as a wrestling promoter. Can you tell me why you wanted to, document the history of wrestling in Northern Ireland?
Well, I guess because I was involved in the local scene. I've been a wrestling fan since I'm 9 years old, but I got involved in the local scene when I was maybe 22, 23 years old. And I guess I got interested in sort of, where we were before that. I got involved in 2014, but there was wrestling in the country since I found out 1930, even before that probably. But what first all happened was I got in touch with a guy. Obviously, I'd heard of Dave's son, Fit Finlay. He's probably the most famous wrestler from Northern Ireland, undoubtedly. But there's another fellow called Eddie Hamill. And Eddie Hamill used to wrestle as Kung Fu on the ITV's World of Sport, like in the 70s and 80s. And I got in touch with Eddie and I invited him to one of our shows. And chatting to Eddie and hearing all the stories just really got me interested in learning even more about the old wrestling scene. And I suppose from there I met Eddie, and I then actually get the chance to meet Dave and his daughter Wendy, and met all these other different wrestlers like Darky Arnott and Ricky Valentine, Rocky Hunter, Diamond Shondell, all these names that at one point I knew nothing about, but that now are a book full of information links. So it just really was sort of being involved myself and wanting to learn more about our own history.
Yeah, the 1920s and 1930s. What was it like in terms of wrestling in Northern Ireland? Because you've got famous people like Dano O'Mahony, who was from Cork. There's a statue to him in Cork. Made it really big in America. Did he come back here?
What happened was that after wrestling was real big before the First World War, and then the First World War happened. After that, I suppose things had to get back to normal, after the war. So wrestling sort of fell on the wayside, and we're still doing the festival shows and carnival shows in America and over in England and stuff. But it sort of died a bit of a death. And then in 1930 itself, that's when it came back in a big way. First of all in Britain, and then of course we eventually got it over. So the very first show in Northern Ireland, well, of course, Dublin got it first. Dublin got the very first one in November 1932, but we got our very first one, and it was called in December 5th, 1932, in the Ulster Hall. And of course, it's all English promoters, all English wrestlers, so it was. And it was branded All In Wrestling, which was this real sort of no holds barred type of wrestling, real almost dirty kind of wrestling, But it sort of, unfortunately, failed. It bombed out. The audience didn't like what they seen, and wrestling sort of again died a wee death over here. And then it actually was when Dano won the world title. He won the world title, I think it was summer 1935, and when he won that, he became a sensation across the world. Irishman, he was the world champion of wrestling. And a year later, in 1936, that summer, Dano came back to Ireland for the first time since he won the belt. And because he came back, of course, they promoted it with a tour of him wrestling in every province in Ireland, So he wrestled, in Connacht, Leinster, Munster, and of course in Ulster. And I think he had I think it was King's Hall, perhaps it was, or Ulster Hall again, and he had thousands come to see it. So I suppose whenever Dano kind of became champion, everyone in Ireland got a new interest in wrestling, and from 1936 onwards, that's when wrestling stays steady. So Dano really, I suppose, because he was champion at one point, sort of helped that.
Yeah. So we have the history of Northern Ireland, the wrestling in Northern Ireland, but of course it's impossible to tell the history of Northern Ireland without the Finlay family, and I'm very honoured to have Dave Finlay Sr. here.
Very much.
Of course, Dave, as Nick has mentioned, your son, Dave Jr. is a really famous wrestler, first in World of Sport, then in WCW and then WWE. How did you become involved in wrestling?
Back when the First World War was on, at the time, 1945 or so, I was about 8 years old, and I was involved in an explosion, me and my brother, and I lost my right eye. And as time went on, when I went into any sports, my dad took me along to boxing. He wouldn't let me box because of my eye. Wouldn't let me play rugby because of my eye. And I went into athletics. That was okay. But I discovered in the BB, this guy taught me how to wrestle, but he didn't last long. He had him maybe by a year, like. So that was I was 15-year-old then. So there was nothing about, but anyway, I got married to Evelyn, bless her, she's gone now. And we went to Canada, and with the influx of the Hungarians after the uprising, they were there, and I went along to the YMCA, and there was amateur wrestling like. So I done that as well. After 3 years we come home, I looked for wrestling. I came across a guy called Noel Dargy Arnott, and there was wrestling. So that was pro wrestling as it was then. And with some submission through into me. You went along to the gym like, they threw you in with somebody, and if you survived that, which I did, I thought this is for me here. So that was it. I wrestled with Darky, and I became part owner of the gym as well. Like, so it was just became second nature to me. Like, nobody said to me, "You can't do this because you only one eye." Like, but that was no drawback at all. Like, so the thing, I had 2 arms and 2 legs and a head, and you had to try and get me down. Like, you know.
Your father was sort of involved with wrestling
Yeah,
as well?
my father, yeah, he came from Muckamore, and he left home when he was a young boy, but during them days, in the 20s, yeah, they had all the travelling community come around and these booths, and it said, right, we have a boxer, anybody want to channel them? So my dad jumped up and wrestlers as well, like, so he held his own, like, so from that, like, when he knew we were into the wrestling, like, so lit the torch again for him, but he didn't wrestle as he done most of the organisation of it, like, he became president of it was founded by a Northern Ireland Wrestling Federation, way back then, you know, so there's 4 generations, I think, of it.
It's I do want to talk about your son and your grandchildren as well. But Nick, if I can go back to you for a second, you mentioned there when Dana O'Mahony comes along, there's a renewed interest. When World War II happens, in the book you talk about that. What is the state of wrestling then, and is it impacted by the war? Yeah,
well, wrestling was going like real strong for 37, 38, 39, and then obviously the war happens. I think September 39, so everything stops. But then, and actually it ends up sort of benefiting the local scene, the war, in a way, because what happens is a lot of the English wrestlers who are being brought over for those shows end up going to war, or end up they have other priorities. So what happens is in 1940, the first ever homegrown professional wrestlers are trained in Northern Ireland. Like, before that, there was no pro wrestlers trained here. Like you guys like Dave's father, who are just legitimate tough men. But I mean, actually trained in wrestling. And they're all. I mean, most of them came from they're all shipyard workers. They're trained by a man called Harry Joyce. He's an Englishman, promoter as well. Like, and one of the very first sort of homegrown pros, and Dave will know him. It was Dave Mack. Dave Mack was. He goes on to have a 40-year stint in wrestling. But in 1940, he was one of the very first homegrown guys trained here and go on to wrestle here. So what happened is, after they trade these guys up, the Northern Irish guys, the Irish wrestlers, started take over the shows, and you almost see almost a proper local scene, still run by English people, still run by the hand over in England, but local lads getting their chance. But unfortunately, I suppose because the war is still on, it's very stop-start during those years. Like, for that 5 year, 6 year period, it's very stop-start. Something happens majorly, and all shows are cancelled. And then things go on. Very much like the pandemic. We were very, very stop-start. It was a very similar situation, very stop-start. So it was. But actually, in a way, it funny enough benefited the local scene, because it meant we had to get homegrown guys to fill the shows.
Also, there was the Lancashire guys. They were all miners, and this is the way back in the 20s, and they come up and they grappled around, and this is where catch wrestling came from. From there. So I mean, you had all these guys, and then what they done then, they said, right, I think we need to take this out somewhere. So they went out and done it, and some of them were getting far more money than were for down the pits, like. So it was handed to them as well, coming up from the pits and and at their festivals and all, grappling around like. So, you know, I know guys who come up from the pits, like, you know.
You know, you had to be legitimately hard to be in pro wrestling. Like, you know, you were weeded out if you weren't, like, you know, you know, you couldn't. It's much easier today. That's reality. But back then, like, you know, the reason they were shipyard workers or miners was because they were legitimately hard, you know, working class men. Like, you had to be. You couldn't get in otherwise. You couldn't. Like.
In the post-war world era, when did the Albion Club start up?
Well, what happens is after the war, that's when the local level scene actually comes together, because there's the first ever local level promoter is a guy called Jack McKelland, wrestles as Jack Raymond, but he's a swimmer as well, a very famous swimmer in Ireland, so he is. And Jack McKelland, he is the first local level promoter. He promotes shows. Because Belfast ends up being controlled by the English kind of promoters, they kind of hub Belfast. Jack brings wrestling to the rest of Northern Ireland, and even Ireland. He does shows in Donegal and Sligo and all over the place, but he does shows, you know, mostly in Derry, Ballymena, Craigavon, Newry, Portadown, all these kind of places, you know, Omagh. He literally does the first wrestling show in every other county, bar, you know, Antrim, Down, kind of Belfast. That's Jack McKelland. And actually, one of the lads that Jack gives a debut to is who Dave mentioned earlier, Noel Darky Arnott. Like, Noel debuts in 1950, he's 21 years old, and eventually Jack's promotion, you know, Jack moves on with his life, so he does, like, and the wrestling scene sort of, again, unfortunately, at the end of the 50s, dies a bit of a death, and, you know, Dave's over in Canada, Darky's over in Canada. You didn't know each other at the time, you know, just coincidentally, you know, different parts of Canada. But when Darky comes back in 1962, he opens a gym. He restarts wrestling. A boxer from Belfast called Jackie Briers is the man who sort of, you know, lends him his gym, and then eventually, you know, Darky gets his own gym, and that's the Albion Street Gym. That's when guys like, you know, Dave and Eddie Hamill and this unbelievable class comes in of wrestlers. But
it was in Foreman Street the first when he went in there, and again, all these guys, you know, we're all hard nuts, like, you know. So I mean, if you come from around that area, East Belfast, West Belfast, or you had to, you know, live together and chew bones and stuff like that. You know. So Darky, he then moved to Albion Street, like, you know. But when anybody put you on your back, you could see the stars, like there was. Darky, you need to get a roof in this place.
It's a real rundown gym. All the lads, everyone said the same thing. The gym was awful, just absolutely horrible.
There are a couple of pictures in there of, you know, action in the gym.
Yeah.
But Dave, can I go to you? You became involved in Albion Street then. Did you eventually take over?
Yeah, I became involved in it, and you know, it didn't seem to be any pathway at all, like, you know, and I thought. So Darky said to me, he said, I'm not doing any more promoting. You want to buy in? I bought in. I think it was 30 quid or something. Like. So I set about replacing all the windows and stuff like that, and got on to the landlord, and I said, you need to put a roof in this place. Like. So that's when I got involved. I had come back from Canada in '62, and when I started to wrestle, like, and I ended up putting a ring in my garden, the back garden, and my two kids, David and Wendy, they were in the ring from a very early age, so it seemed to be just part of their life as well, like, you know, as soon as they could stand up and they could wrestle. So we made it fun and stuff like that, but the Albion Street, like, it was even dangerous to walk up the steps, like, you know. So.
You talked about Dave, who obviously we've spoken about, and Wendy, who became the first referee, the first female referee.
Well, our aunt Rosemary, she became the first referee, and one big hell of a to do about it. Like, you know, she was in all these women's magazines and stuff. She was on the TV, and it just. So they didn't come to see the wrestlers, like, they came to see her, Rosemary, and she was brilliant, you know. And then Wendy left home and went over to live with Fit when he was in Manchester. She went over there and refereed in the pro wrestling as well, like. Plus she was an international referee in the Olympic type wrestling as well, like. So we were able to combine both styles, like, you know. So they were brought up like my grandkids now, they're brought up like if you go in the ring, maybe some guy would try and take advantage of you, like, you know, and not take advantage of because of their, you know, wrestling, the strong type of wrestling, submission wrestling and stuff like that there.
So when it becomes, you know, a family business, because is your brother's a referee?
My brother is a referee.
Your father's involved. Your children are involved.
Yeah.
Around the time when the Troubles kick off, I know you go to Wales for you went to Wales for a while.
When it kicked off here really bad, and Oric, when he was a promoter, he came over here and promoted, and he said, come on over here and bring the whole family. So we did that for a while. But and then we come back again. But what I did then, and I looked around and I seen, but things had settled. Well, it hadn't settled down, but most of the time there was festivals about, and they were run by the parish priest. So I got on to the parish priest and stuff like that, all over the place. And I said, we're wrestling, and we just packed the place out, like. And we wrestled down in the monastery down in Fermanagh there. So we were all over the place.
Yeah. So that's what I was going to say. It's, you know, it's really probably the only sport or social activity at that time that was completely cross community.
Yeah, it was cross community because one of the times there was the Loyalist Club in the Shankill Road here. So we wrestled in there. I brought her in state over. And the week after, we're up in the Crumlin Stars Social Club. So it was one extreme to the other, but we were welcomed at any time, like, you know. So I mean, and what I used to do with boys, we had the Irish Rebels, you know, they were all boys dressed up in green, white and gold, and then we'd put them on with somebody who with Marina Jacks on and got away with it, like, you know. So
wrestling was so cross community. Although you poked the bear, I think, so you did do on that. But
you know, so we, you know, oh, thanks for coming. We were up all over the place, Derry, you know, Toonbridge, Arbo, you name it, we were there. But in the summertime, I captured the parish priests all over the place, like, you know, and Ben Burb down to the monastery down there, and they. When I could pay it out, like, I would just say, it's going to cost you this for the show. So we went into the monastery and they opened this cupboard out and there was stacked with money, like, you know, and I thought, I should have had another few quid on there.
so when we're in this, you know, era of the Troubles, and as we see, Dave's wrestling is going everywhere, that almost coincides with the popularity of World of Sport on ITV. Yeah. Can you tell us about that and the impact that had on popularising wrestling again?
Well, wrestling got like a really big boom in the 60s. Like obviously, more, you know, like what Dave's about for, you know, myself and yourself maybe. But like a real big boom in the 60s because a lot more people got TVs in Ireland in the 60s, you know, like, you know, so that meant we could actually watch the wrestling on TV before that you couldn't have. And wrestling just in Britain as well, the British wrestling scene just boomed up. So the 60s had a great, like, sort of like the English promoters were bringing over their top names, the top Irish guys, like, you know, Dave and Eddie and Darky were all coming up, you know, and stuff. And then what happened was that when the Troubles happened, the English promoters just pulled out of here. They just left. At a time, Dave was the only kind of promoter really locally going. And then, of course, Dave, because you were successful, more promoters came out of that locally. But when the Troubles happened, you know, understandably, the English guys were like, we don't want no more piece of this, they don't like, you know. But yeah, World of Sport, again, the TV wrestling was the biggest really in the like early mid-60s and then again in the 70s, like, you know, and that's, you know, when you had guys like, again, you I mentioned before, Eddie Hamill, Kung Fu debuted in, well, actually Tug Wilson was the first one. He debuted in 72. Another Belfast wrestler, Eric Tug Wilson. And then Eddie Hamill, as Kung Fu did in 1974 on TV. And, you know, went on to wrestle guys, the famous names like, you know, McManus, went on to wrestle like, you know, with Big Daddy and Giant Haystack. So, yeah, the TV wrestling, Dave, you really came in when the TV wrestling sort of boomed up wrestling. And it helped the local crowds too, because, you know, if wrestling was on the billboard, they were going to see it, you know, because they're so popular.
I would be amiss if I didn't mention Jack Flash Sherlock. You know, because I was talking to his nephew a couple of days ago. You know, so he was another big name.
Yeah, and he looked well now. He looked well in the ring now, and he was very popular. Like, so they pushed him on too, like, you know, bring him in. So yeah, good looking boy, like, so he was, and a good wrestler.
Shirlow versus Finlay was, you know, later on they became promoters, but early on it was Shirlow versus Finlay with a big bout.
He came from Lisburn, so I went down there, like, and I came from Carrick, so I mean it was ding dong all the way along, like, you know. So people seen this needle match. It was a needle match all the time, so we took it everywhere, that needle match, like, and so we done it in tag teams and stuff like that there, but it was really, really great. But and then my son went to Belfast or Manchester then, because he was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Games, and he said, no, I'm away, like, so he went over there when he was 18. He just blew it apart, like, over there. He came.
He worked for Max Crabtree then?
Yeah, he worked for Max Crabtree Joint Promotions, and Brian from Ireland, like, he was hated at that time, like, you know, really hated, and he made sure they hated him, like, you know. So he done well, like, and he went to Germany there, successful there as well, like, you know. So the professional wrestling, you know, you made lots of friends and stuff like that, and with the book here, like, this is just, it blows my mind with this book, and with Nick, what he's done, like, and there's stuff in there. I was out with our guy the other day. He says, I didn't know who that guy was. Well, I said, you need to go to Nick, don't ask me. He knows.
So yeah, your son, you know, I can still remember his debut in WCW in the 80s, and then goes on to
kicked the head of
Regal, yeah. So when America, you know, it's flourishing in the 80s and 90s, but here, with the decision to cancel World of Sport in the 1980s, how did that impact local wrestling?
Wrestling was sort of like, it really, again, I was saying it boomed in the 70s and the early 80s, but funny enough, at the same time it sort of boomed, like, it's sort of the older kind of guard, like, you know, Jack Flash Shirlow ran his own shows with another wrestler called Wilbur Monroe, and obviously Dave was still going, there's other promoters too, so there was, but everyone just sort of, you know, slowly but surely stopped. Like, I suppose, Dave, you end up focusing more on the amateur wrestling.
Yeah. I did it when my son and my daughter went over there, and I thought, you know, right, I'll go back to the amateur wrestling, you know, so I opened up the first club in Northern Ireland, and I produced, I don't know, many British champions at that, and I went to 4 Commonwealth Games, and I produced Commonwealth Games competitors. So that was my other lifeline as well, like, you know. So, and then when this MMA took off, so they asked me to Tom Lamont down in Lisburn to come down there and show them takedowns and amateur wrestling. So
it was kind of like, as you sort of lost interest and other promoters lost interest, there was less shows, so there's less wrestlers coming through, there's less wrestlers having opportunities, and the local scene just kind of died away in the 80s, didn't it, Dave?
It did.
You know?
It did.
Even before TV, it came off, you know, it kind of, I mean, Org Williams at a point, Org Williams was a Welsh promoter, like, who was here from the 60s, he was a real character himself, wasn't he, Dave?
Yeah.
And Org Williams became the only promoter, he wasn't local, he was from Wales, who ran here anymore, but it just sort of became, you guys lost interest.
Yeah, I think what had happened also, they, if you went to local councils and you said, I'm going to hire the hall, you had to have a powerful insurance and stuff like that.
The leisure centre,
all the
community centre became leisure centres.
You know, but it killed it off. But what I had rings for, used to be nightclubs there in Belfast there, and Piccadilly line they called it, and they took this ring up with 3 flights of stairs, but I adjusted it just so that, and got a welders and welded it, and so I thought, oh, I don't want to take this up and down this ring, and I said to the guy who won the Piccadilly line, I said, you want to buy a ring there? And I bought the ring, so the ring was there, and we were in there. We'd just done three matches, like, and all the old wrestlers come out of the woodwork and wanted to wrestle on this there, the Piccadilly line. You know?
There's some great gimmicks of, like, what Dave different kind of shows David pulled. They're all in the books there, like, so that there's something like the castle, Carver Castle and stuff too. But,
medieval.
Yeah, but unfortunately the scene just sort of died in the 80s, and then I think in 1987 that's the first time the WWF was shown on British TV, and whenever the Americans came in, like, the reality is the British stuff was all sort of like, kind of smaller, tighter venues and, less glitz and glamour. But when the Americans came in, they had the full glamour, and like, it just looks better, especially for kids. It looks better on TV. That's the reality of it. Like.
Yeah. So your son goes to America. He goes and his imprint there is even today, where he's training the wrestlers. Is that style that you taught him? Can we just talk about, because we're coming towards the end, about wrestling today? Locally, you're involved in, promotion. You have Titanic Wrestling. I have to give them a shout out. We were there a couple of weeks ago with my kids, and it was a fantastic show. There seems to be a bit of, revival, locally, and the likes of yourself, you're paying tribute to, generations gone by. The lockdown, before lockdown, Titanic Wrestling had Marty Jones over, people like that. So do you see there's, people are looking back towards, what was probably a golden age of wrestling in Northern
These are all rival promoter dates there. What do you got?
I hadn't had too many rivals, quite honestly, but if there was any rivals came along, I was totally into the Olympic style wrestling then, But I know one story is what I believe this story, like, with Oric and some other promoters, like, so what Oric had done, he went and stole one of their posts. So when the guys arrived at the venue, there were only 3 posts, like, so they had to cancel it, like, and Oric was a few streets away.
They played dirty back then.
So
the local scene these days, I mean, wrestling again, for a long time in like the late 80s, 90s, there was no local scene. Like Fit Finlay was over conquering the world, but there was no local scene anymore. And all the guys that just, Dave, Eddie, everyone had stops they have, Darky, they all stops they have. And really about, the book actually ends in about 2002, but in 2002, that's when the local level scene comes back. At the end of the book, there's no spoiler, it's a history book, I say that in about 10 years time, that covers 70 years of history. I'm going to cover the last 30 to make it 100 years total in about 10 years time, and cover the rejuvenation. But the scene today, as opposed to the scene that Dave was involved in, is totally different. It's just far different. It is like, again, I certainly enjoy doing my shows. Like, I have a good
shows.
Oh yeah, I have good lads, and we all have the crack like and stuff. But well, there was never money in it, Dave. First of all, so there's still no money today. But it's just I do it for the fun of it, and just the enjoyment of it. Like, but the local scene is, I suppose, it's building back up again. Like, it has its troubles, it has its wee things. If you're involved in it, you know too much about it. That's the problem. So I can't say too much.
Me and Darky went along to the jail, Crown Road Jail, to see it match. Now, you must remember he comes from the old style, like, with me doing promoter, you want to get the best guys and play. So he says, at the interval, he says, I'm going home, like. He says, them guys know nothing, like. They wouldn't know a hammer lock from a Yale lock. So come on, we're going.
Darky Arnold's, Dave's mentor, and a great part of the book. So is, like, your trainer, Dave, wasn't he? Yeah. Like, Darky's 91, and Dave went to that show, like, and I think they loved the setup. But you appreciate the wrestling, but Darky did not appreciate. Yeah. It's literally 2 different eras, really.
Dave, your grandchildren
are
wrestling.
Yeah.
Dave Junior has been wrestling in New Japan.
He's in New Japan.
And Impact Wrestling.
Yes, he's back now in America, and they're doing shows in America. So he's come back to America, and they're wrestling there for Impact Wrestling, and my other grandson, Brogan, he's been doing wee local shows, but Ring of Honor, I've been in touch with him, so it's looking good for them, like, and I'd said to them, listen, these guys have to be good because you have a name to live up to here, There's no, so
You're a great grandfather now too, Dave. So you have another generation in the pipeline.
Yeah, another generation. So we're 4 generations, and I love it. You know, I just love it. And every time I come on the phone, I says, make sure you get into the gym and listen. And the first impression's the best. Like, don't be standing in the corner like the post. You know, move around. They're going, yeah.
Nick, can you tell people where they can find the book?
I published the book through Amazon. I thought they're a really easy service to use. So it's Falls, Brawls and Townhalls. I can't even take credit for the title. It's a great title, so it is, but I can't even take credit. A guy called, a wrestler called Campbell came up with it. But Falls, Brawls and Townhalls, History of Pro Wrestling in Northern Ireland is available on Amazon. So best place to get it there. Or if you're chatting myself, you can get it off myself too, so you can. So.
Can I just say about that, like, it was a pleasure to meet him, like, and the research he's done like that there. And I was just saying them, like, the CSI would be after him and all that.
I'm going into private investigation now,
exactly.
after finding all you guys.
Yeah, I absolutely, you know, it's absolutely brilliant, like, to highlight the wrestling went on there and there, like, you know, so.
It's fantastic. Dave and Nick, thanks very much for joining me. That was brilliant. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.